Andrew Doyle is with me today. Andrew is a British comedian, playwright, journalist, political satirist, and author who co-created the fictional character Jonathan Pye and the equally, or perhaps even more fictional character Titania McGrath. He recently published his first book, Free Speech, Why It Matters, which came out in 2021, but previously published two more as the aforementioned Titania McGrath. The first of those was Woke, A Guide to Social Justice, published in 2019, and the second was My First Little Book of Intersectional Activism, published in 2020. I haven't met Andrew before. I'm looking forward to talking with him about free speech and about his satire and about the intersection between those two and whatever else comes up. Thank you very much for coming on today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, shall we start perhaps with a discussion of your book? I finished it yesterday. I've become notorious, I suppose, for my particular take on free speech, and so it was a book that interested me. Tell me why you wrote it and what you learned in all of those things.
Well, it's not the sort of book I ever envisaged that I would have to write. I think if you go back 10, 15 years, the idea that free speech, which is obviously the seedbed of all our liberties, would be something that we would have to defend, would have probably seemed a little bit ridiculous to me, because I basically took it for granted. I thought that everyone was on that side. But I fear that something has happened, particularly over the past 10 years or so, and it is connected, I feel, with the rise of this social justice movement, or what we might call critical social justice, or however we want to call it. A lot of people call it the woke movement. However you want to label that ideology, which at its heart has a real mistrust of free speech. And you hear it all the time in the kind of phrases that the activists use, phrases like words are violence, or this kind of language normalizes hate or legitimizes hate, or all this kind of thing. And there's a real genuine mistrust of the power of language to effectively corrupt the masses. And what I wanted to do, I suppose, was try and marshal a defense for this principle that I had always taken for granted, but at the same time attempt to grapple with the concerns that people might have. Because my worry with the culture war, as we call it, is that you have two sort of extreme poles arguing against each other, and most people are caught in the middle. I think most people are broadly for the idea of free speech, but they have a few reservations. For instance, when it comes to demagogues espousing hate or hate against a particular minority group or something like that, or people are concerned about the ways in which language can cause harm, and I don't think anyone would deny that words can be hurtful. So most people, I think, are somewhere in between and are open to persuasion. And I think my point, my principal argument in the book, is that absolute freedom of speech is always going to be better. And in fact, by promoting free speech, you're doing something to help those very people that you are concerned about.
So recently, the Scottish Parliament passed a hate crime law that has its supporters and also its detractors. And I'd be interested in your feeling about that. Now, you said, I believe in this book, if I remember the statistics correctly, that there have been 120,000 incidents of police investigated speech hate crime in Britain in how long? That's been over the last 5 years or so?
It's worse than that. The statistic I quote is between 2014 and 2019, there are 120,000 recorded incidents of non-crime. They call them non-crime hate incidents, and this is something which is now routine in the UK. I mean, obviously, I'm going to be talking about the UK, and the US and Canada is a very different kettle of fish, I'm sure. And I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching won't be familiar with the problems we have in the UK. Of course, we don't have constitutional protection for free speech. We don't have a First Amendment. We don't have anything like that, so we are particularly vulnerable. And at the moment, unfortunately, in the UK, the police who are trained by the College of Policing, who do issue very specific guidelines about this, and anyone can check this, because if you go to the government's website on hate crime and hate speech, they make very clear what they're talking about. What they say is that there are 5 protected characteristics, and these fall into race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, and disability. I think I may have misquoted that, but there's one missing. But anyway, there are 5 protected characteristics, and if a victim, and they do use the word victim rather than complainant, if a victim perceives that any speech or crime was motivated by hatred towards any of those 5 protected characteristics, then it qualifies as a hate crime if it's criminal. If it's not criminal, if it's just speech or something like that, it qualifies as a non-crime hate incident. Police will investigate that. They will record that. And although non-crime incidents don't lead to prosecution, they do go on a criminal reference check that many people take. We call it a disclosure and barring service here. So it can affect your employment prospects.
And is that without a trial? That's recorded without a trial. So
of course, there's no
you
trial.
get a quasi-criminal record.
You get something flagged up when you, particularly if you're applying for a teaching job, say something like that, where you're working with children. It's very important, and you get this thing flagged up. So it does have serious ramifications. But even beyond that, we have hate speech laws, which are encoded into the Public Order Act, which is one example. But the main example is the Electronic Communications Act 2003. In this country, and I do quote the statistic in the book as well, we have roughly 3,000 people arrested a year for offensive things that they have said online. That's so. In other words, 9 people a day, roughly, the police in the UK are arresting. And the people in the UK will be familiar with this, because if you see the Twitter accounts of various police forces, various police departments across the country, they often put things out like, you know, make sure you don't say anything offensive or thoughtless online, or we will be knocking on your door. They say these very kind of frightening things. There was a recent police display outside a supermarket in the UK. It went viral, this image. It was then next to a big digital billboard, and the slogan on the billboard was, "Being offensive is an offence." And this was flanked by police officers who were socially distanced, but they were there in their masks, which made it seem slightly even more sinister. They got in a lot of trouble for that, because people were saying, well, being offensive surely isn't a crime. But actually the problem with that is that the police clearly thought it was a crime, and they were acting on that basis. They'd obviously hadn't just concocted this billboard out of nothing. They'd really considered what it should say. And more to the point, actually they were right. In this country, you can go to prison for jokes, for offensive remarks, and people have gone to prison, have been arrested routinely for causing offence. And of course, the notion of offence is incredibly subjective. In fact, the legal stipulation in the Communications Act is that you will have broken the law if the judge and jury deem that you have communicated material that is, quote unquote, grossly offensive. Well, I don't know how you define that. I wouldn't.
Well, and also, who defines it is the real question, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've looked into this legislation to some degree, and one of the things that struck me about it was that it seems to be purposefully left up to the hypothetical victim to define offense, which has become a subjective reality. And you can understand why that might be to some degree, because how would you define hate? And how would you define offense without, especially the latter, without making recourse to someone's subjective experience? But then, of course, well, we'll delve into that in a moment. I should start with the hard question, I suppose, which is, well, clearly people can say hateful things, and those things can be damaging psychologically and physiologically, I suppose, if people are stressed enough, and the borderline is very difficult to identify. Why is it that people shouldn't just assume that you're a mean loudmouth and that they shouldn't pay any attention to you at all because you're concerned about this? I mean, that's the general criticism of critics of hate speech, let's say. And so why in the world aren't the people who are putting this forward just trying to make the world a nicer place? What's the big problem here?
Well, I think a lot of people do assume that I'm a mean loudmouth. I think they assume that about most people who defend freedom of speech. But I'm sure the latter part of your question is absolutely right, insofar as I imagine a lot of the people who are sceptical about free speech are in fact trying to make the world a better place. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I mean, the problem here is that the legislation as it currently stands here means that, for instance, if you say something critical about me and I perceive that it was motivated by hatred towards me on the basis of my sexuality, for instance, I could phone the police and that would be recorded and would appear on hate crime statistics in this country, because it's all about perception. That word is used about 5 or 6 times within the one passage in the hate crime legislation, the word perception. of the victim. And again, I say victim, not complainant, which suggests a complete disregard for due process, but I suppose we can leave that aside. But the most common and the most frightening misconception I have found when it comes to people defending free speech is that they are doing so because they want to have the right to say appalling things about people with no comeback whatsoever, and they want to go back to some imaginary good old days, you know, where you could just be casually homophobic and racist and sexist and all the rest of it, and no one would call you out for that. Now, I don't know anyone who falls into that category, and most people who are, advocating for free speech are doing so precisely because they are aware that in countries where free speech protections are meagre, minorities tend to suffer the most. And in fact, there is it seems to be a corollary to me that those who are genuinely for free speech are also for equal rights and protecting the vulnerable in society. And this perception, which I really find unpleasant, this perception that if you are standing up for this most foundational of principles for freedom of speech, if you're standing up for that, you can only be doing so if you have a nefarious motive. I mean, what a horribly pessimistic view of humanity. And it seems to be...
Well, it seems to be a direct derivation of the hypothesis, for example, that all Western social organizations, particularly Western, are based on power and are best conceived of as tyrannical. And so if that's your view, why would you not assume that most use of speech is essentially an exercise of power in the service of tyranny?
But then why would you assume that the government in control of any particular country isn't part of that tyranny that you're describing? It seems odd to me to be mindful of the potential for tyranny, but then to outsource all your individual liberties to the state. It seems contradictory to me.
Well, I guess the way that is elided over is by allowing the hypothetical individual victim to define the offense.
This is the problem, though.
The problem I've run into, and this is partly why I appreciated your book, is that increasingly people are called upon to defend fundamental assumptions that were so taken for granted that virtually no one has an argument that's fully articulated at hand. Yeah. When no one questions free speech, no one has to defend it thoroughly. As soon as it's questioned, well, it becomes an extraordinarily complicated problem. The same with gender identity. When no one's paying attention to it, it's obvious. But as soon as you have to think it through, it becomes a rat's nest, to say the least. When I was in the UK a few years ago, I saw a number of things that I felt were disturbing. People seem to have accepted the omnipresence of CCTV cameras to a degree that I found horrifying, frankly. I don't like CCTV cameras. I don't like the message they portray, which is that everyone is criminal enough so they should be surveyed all the time and someone needs to be watching. I noticed too in London in particular that many buildings had instituted airport level security so that you had to pass through a metal detector and have your bags checked, etc., while you were moving in and out of buildings. And it struck me as quite horrifying, given that, as far as I'm concerned, Great Britain and its legal and parliamentary traditions are at the epicenter of Western freedoms. I mean, you could make a case for France, I suppose, but not a strong one as far as I'm concerned. Yet your citizens seem to have accepted this with virtually no problem. And now, on the heels of that, we have this multiplication of hate crime.
That's as much a surprise to me as it is to you. I mean, you won't have seen all of the CCTV cameras. Apparently, they're absolutely everywhere. You can't walk anywhere in the UK without being potentially monitored. I'm not saying someone's watching you all the time, but things are being recorded and digitized. And it's interesting to me because I remember back in the early 2000s when the government was trying to push through its ID card scheme, and broadly speaking, the left were unanimously against it, and they didn't like this idea of living in a society where there's someone on the corner saying papers please. No one really wanted that, but we've become very docile and very accepting of the idea that we need to be coddled and monitored by the state. I mean, I know there's a recent debate about vaccine passports, and people seem very blasé about this idea that we might have to have our ID embedded and encoded onto a card to get anywhere or to do anything. So I think there's something going on there, and it is connected with what you've brought up in terms of hate crime legislation. We've just become accustomed. I mean, you mentioned specifically the problem in Scotland. And seriously, it relates very closely to what you're saying, because the SNP, who are the only really party with any clout in Scotland, that's the Scottish National Party, and it's never a good idea, is it, when you have one political party which doesn't really have an opposition. They have a reputation for quite nanny state-ish policies. You know, they introduced what was it called, the named person scheme. It didn't go through in the end, but they wanted to assign every child born in Scotland with a state guardian. You know, they effectively didn't trust the parents to raise their own kids. They have other examples, you know, minimum pricing on alcohol, or a ban on 2-for-1 pizzas because they don't trust poor people not to gain weight. So all sorts of these sorts of policies. But in this current hate crime bill, which has just sailed through because there's no opposition, Humza Yousaf, the Justice Secretary, has pushed through, he's specifically included an element to this bill which says that they can criminalise you for things you say in the privacy of your own home. I mean, that to me that's just a given. I would have never thought that anyone in this country would not consider that to be an incredible invasion of individual liberty.
You can make a strong case for Scotland as the ground zero for many of the developing many of the concepts that undergird the entire Western notion of freedom, and to see that emerging in Scotland is absolutely stunningly terrifying as far as I'm concerned.
You think of Mel Gibson with a face covered in woad shouting freedom as he's executed, you know, in Braveheart. You do think of Scotland as being associated with it, but honestly, Scotland, for some reason, and I don't know what it is, and it might be to do that it's effectively this one-party state, it seems to have this incredible sense, and they've really bought into this idea that unless they can police the thought and speech of their citizens, then they will just run amok. There's another element to that bill. I don't know if you know about this. There's a specific element on the bill which talks about the public performance of a play. So they've effectively said that they will criminalise public performances. So say if it can be deemed that those performances were designed to stir up hatred. That's the formulation, stir up hatred. I'm not quite sure what that means necessarily, but when Humza Yousaf was questioned about this in Parliament, he actually said, well, theoretically, a neo-Nazi or someone from the far right could get together with a group of actors and put on a play to recruit people to his cause. And as I said at the time, you know, I don't know any neo-Nazis, but they're not into amateur dramatics. That's not their thing. They don't do that. They wouldn't get involved. And yet he's got this idea in his head that is a feasible... I mean, it seems ridiculous, but it's not really, because the ramifications are quite serious. And the way it's just gone through without any opposition really troubles me. I mean, there have been modifications, I should say, in fairness. In the initial bill, in the initial draft of the bill, they had said that you could be criminalised irrespective of intention. In other words,
yes,
if you
that was terrifying.
Awful. I mean, if you wrote a play that then stimulated someone to join the far right, then you were still responsible whether you intended it or not. Now, the problem, as you know, with theatrical representation or any kind of artistic representation, is sometimes you want to represent the worst aspects of humanity, because that's part of drama and literature and all the rest of it. I mean, there would be no artistic freedom if that went through. So fortunately, that element of the bill was modified.
Well, and also the attempt to reverse the idea that intent is important that's even more catastrophic. It's always been a miracle to me that our legal system ever became psychologically sophisticated enough so that intent rather than outcome was what mattered. Because you have to be a sophisticated thinker to see that someone has done damage to someone else, and so the damage is real and marked and troublesome and costly, all of that, painful. But because the intent wasn't there, the severity of the action is dramatically mitigated. That's a sign of maturity and sophistication to note that. And the fact that it's built into the legal system is nothing short of remarkable. And then to remove that and to make the felt consequences the arbiter of the reality of the situation is a dreadful assault on the integrity of the law as such, as far as I can tell.
Well, moreover, it's something that everyone intuitively understands. We all understand the difference between murder and manslaughter. You know, we all understand that intent actually does, like you say, escalate the the severity of a crime, and it's bigger than that, isn't it? It's because this idea that intention doesn't matter is actually built into so much of this what we call social justice discourse. If you think of critical race theory, it's just a given that there are racist structures, and you can be racist without intending to be racist. And I really do dispute that, because I think in order to be racist, intention has to be at the heart of that. Otherwise, it's incoherent to me. But this is really a degraded view of humanity. I feel, where we are effectively like marionettes, and that we're just being played, and that we don't have any agency anymore, and therefore we can't be responsible for our own words. Not just our actions. We can't be responsible for our own words and the ramifications. So we have to be controlled, and we have to be stifled by the state, and it makes me very nervous.
So I've been thinking through the importance of free speech, I suppose, from a psychological perspective. And it seems to me that, well, we can walk through some axioms and you can tell me what you think about them if you would. So, I mean, the first thing we might posit is that it's useful to think. It's better to think than not to think. And that might seem self-evident, but thought can be troublesome and stir up trouble, and your thoughts can be inaccurate. So it's perhaps not that unreasonable to start the questioning there. But I think it was Alfred North Whitehead who said that thinking allows our thoughts to die instead of us. And so he was thinking about the evolution of thought in some sense from a biological perspective. So imagine a creature that's incapable of thought has to act something out, a representation of the world or an intent. It has to be embodied. And then if that fails, well, it fails in action. And so the consequence of that might be death. It might be very severe. Whereas once you can think, you can represent the world abstractly. You can divorce the abstraction from the world, and then you can produce avatars of yourself, sometimes in image, like in dreams, let's say, or in literature and fiction and movies and so on. Produce avatars of ourselves that are fictional, and then run them as simulations in the abstract world and observe the consequences. And we do that in our stories. We do that when we dream. We do that when we imagine in images and depict a dramatic scenario playing itself out. But then we also do that in words, because we encode those images. It's one more level of abstraction. We encode those images into words, and those words become partial dramatic avatars, and then the words can battle with one another. So thought seems to work, let's say verbal thought. You ask yourself a question.
The reason for that is that the programming. So you're programmed. So yes, you again, the brain is just a memory capsule. So we were all programmed to know both sides of the story. We were programmed to watch them play out and assist them play out on either side. And when I say either side, I mean there's thousands of different sides, because we're divided. But as far as the politics goes, and living under a totalitarian government, yes, it was all played out. We watched all the Twilight Zone episodes, right? We watched all the movies, the television shows. You guys read all those books, right? Remember all those sci-fi books, all the, like I was saying on yesterday's videos that I was doing to you, Jordan, the fiction and science fiction and nonfiction, it's all the fucking same, because it's all lies, all of it. So you have to start over again. And maybe the reason why we're not allowed to know the lies verbally or in the programming, straight up, just like straight up, like I'm trying to do with you now, is maybe there was a fear. This is what we're supposed to think anyway. There's a fear that society cannot handle that. Society cannot handle the truth. We've been told all these little lines and programmed these lines in the movies and the television shows, these phrases that just light up in our memory banks in our brains because we think our brains are full of intelligence. They're not. It's our neurological system. So what it is your conscious fights your subconscious because your subconscious knows everything without ever asking a question. The truth, I should say, without ever asking a question. Your conscious mind only knows what it memorized from its environment. So all those were all lies. And and so here we are again. You're talking with this guy. I like what you guys are saying, that maybe you guys will wake up some people or whatever, but you're only waking them up to more bad and to not recognize what has happened over the last few thousand years and keep playing along with it as, oh, we're just figuring this out. How is it that they're getting away with this? Well, come on, it was ignored by the majority of the population, and that was the way it was supposed to be. I mean, you could just take the entire Twilight Zone, first series when they first came out with it. I think it was in the 30s or something, right? Maybe they were in the 40s. I don't know. It was mostly still black and white, I think, when they first came out. Oh no, that's right. That's right. It wasn't movies. It was on television. So maybe it was even in the 50s. But anyways, either way, take those episodes. I'm only saying that because my family was here the other day, and we got in conversations, and every conversation they brought up, everything they were trying to piss me off with, all came from Twilight episodes. So as soon as they would make one remark and conversate, kind of like you guys are doing now, and then I would say, "Oh, I remember that episode. That was the episode where the aliens came down, and with their book, they had a book on how to serve humans, and then all the humans said to themselves, "Oh yeah, they're here to serve us. They're going to serve us. They're not here to hurt us. They're here to serve us." And they all went on. This went on for, who knows, in the show, I forget, like a few years goes by or whatever. And then the aliens got all these lines of, thousands at the time that would go on to their spacecraft. Unbelievable fucking nonsense. So it goes on to their spacecraft, and one of the guys figures out that it's a recipe book. And when they mean to serve humans, they mean serve humans. So it's a recipe book of how to best cook humans and eat them and everything like that. So so I said that to my family when they were telling me stories, and I'm like, all these things are coming from your Bibles, your religious books, your television shows, your movies, your sci-fi shit, and they want to call it science because you backed them up with it. And here you are again. You're about to back them up with more science. The science is another religion. I'm gonna have to keep saying it to you. Hopefully you'll come to these videos and maybe you'll go look at what I'm showing you and you'll understand that it's all been a sci-fi episode. And to be honest, looking at it all from where I am now, I don't understand how all these intelligent people missed it all these years. Me, I can understand it. I was drunk and stupid and not really interested in knowing any of these things. So until the awakening just happens, it just happens. So when you're told to go look around and see things for what they are, go look around and see things for what they are. Stop this. This is ridiculous. I mean, you're like this close to seeing it all on everything, and I watch and listen to you.
Of intention. In other words,
Yes,
if you
that was
wrote
terrifying.
awful, if you wrote a play that then stimulated someone to join the far right, then you were still responsible whether you intended it or not. Now the problem, as you know, with theatrical representation or any kind of artistic representation, is sometimes you want to represent the worst aspects of humanity, because that's part of drama and literature and all the rest of it. I mean, there would be no artistic freedom if that went through. So fortunately, that element of the bill was modified.
Well, and also the attempt to reverse the idea that intent is important that's even more catastrophic. It's always been a miracle to me that our legal system ever became psychologically sophisticated enough so that intent rather than outcome was what mattered. Because you have to be a sophisticated thinker to see that someone has done damage to someone else, and so the damage is real and marked and troublesome and costly, all of that, painful. But because the intent wasn't there, the severity of the action is dramatically mitigated. That's a sign of maturity and sophistication to note that. And the fact that it's built into the legal system is nothing short of remarkable. And then to remove that and to make the felt consequences the arbiter of the reality of the situation is a dreadful assault on the integrity of the law as such, as far as I can tell.
Well, moreover, it's something that everyone intuitively understands. We all understand the difference between murder and manslaughter. You know, we all understand that intent actually does, like you say, escalate the severity of a crime, and it's bigger than that, isn't it? It's because this idea that intention doesn't matter is actually built into so much of this what we call social justice discourse. If you think of critical race theory, it's just a given that there are racist structures, and you can be racist without intending to be racist. And I really do dispute that, because I think in order to be racist, intention has to be at the heart of that. Otherwise, it's incoherent to me. But this is really a degraded view of humanity. I feel, where we are effectively like marionettes, and that we're just being played, and that we don't have any agency anymore, and therefore we can't be responsible for our own words. Not just our actions. We can't be responsible for our own words and the ramifications. So we have to be controlled, and we have to be stifled by the state, and it makes me very nervous.
So I've been thinking through the importance of free speech, I suppose, from a psychological perspective, and it seems to me that, well, we can walk through some axioms, and you can tell me what you think about them if you would. So, I mean, the first thing we might posit is that it's useful to think. It's better to think than not to think, and that might seem self-evident, but thought can be troublesome and stir up trouble, and your thoughts can be inaccurate. So it's perhaps not that unreasonable to start the questioning there. But I think it was Alfred North Whitehead who said that thinking allows our thoughts to die instead of us. And so he was thinking about the evolution of thought in some sense from a biological perspective. So imagine a creature that's incapable of thought has to act something out, a representation of the world or an intent. It has to be embodied. And then if that fails, well, it fails in action. And so the consequence of that might be death. It might be very severe. Whereas once you can think, you can represent the world abstractly, you can divorce the abstraction from the world, and then you can produce avatars of yourself, sometimes in image, like in dreams, let's say, or in literature and fiction and movies and so on. Produce avatars of ourselves that are fictional, and then run them as simulations in the abstract world and observe the consequences. And we do that in our stories. We do that when we dream. We do that when we imagine in images and depict a dramatic scenario playing itself out. But then we also do that in words, because we encode those images. It's one more level of abstraction. We encode those images into words, and those words become partial dramatic avatars, and then the words can battle with one another. So thought seems to work, let's say verbal thought. You ask yourself a question, you receive an answer in some mysterious manner. There's an internal revelation of sorts. That's the spontaneous thought. You know, when you sit down to write a book, thoughts come to you, perhaps because you pose yourself a question, and no one knows how that works, but we experience it, that thoughts manifest themselves in the theater of our imagination. So that's the revelatory aspect. And then there's the critical aspect, which is, well, now you've thought this and perhaps you've written it down. Can you generate counter positions? Are there universes that you can imagine where this doesn't apply? Are there situations where it doesn't apply? Are there better ways of formulating that thought? But I would say, with regard to critical thought, and to some degree with regard to productive thought, an indeterminate proportion of that is dependent on speech. I don't think it's unreasonable to point out that thought is internalized speech. And the dialectical process that constitutes critical thinking is internalized speech. So you and I are engaging in a dialectic enterprise. You'll posit something and I'll respond to it, and you'll respond to that. And we're 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 in a kind of combat. There's some cooperation about it as well. And we're attempting to formulate a truth more clearly, at least in principle, if we're being honest. We do that when we're speaking. So our thought, the quality of our thought is actually dependent on our ability to speak our minds.
Absolutely.
And then, so go ahead.
Well, I couldn't agree more, because I think speech is the way in which we collaborate on our thoughts. That's how it works. You refine those thought processes that you've described. I mean, I'm no psychologist, but I understand this basic premise that we have these various thoughts that are continually in conflict within ourselves. Unless we're able to articulate them and to engage in others through that process, through that transactional process of speech, then those thoughts are never refined and they remain in this kind of infancy. And this is
yes,
why
well, they're as refined as we can make them as individuals. Sure. But that's also assuming that you even have the words, which you also learned in a dialectical process.
Right, exactly. It's not as though the truth is ever fully graspable, but we can get nearer to it through that collaborative process of speaking and articulating the thoughts. And in fact, even in the act of, like you say, writing or articulating yourself, as with your self-authoring program, for instance, the act of writing things out is what clarifies the point of view for you. I've actually found that the way that I think about these issues now is largely a product of the fact that I've written so much about it and changed my mind through the act of learning how to express myself on these points. And the consequence of not having that opportunity, I think, is something I would barely want to contemplate. And I think that, to give an example of the moment, which is that because any kind of attempt to have a discussion or debate about the perceived conflict between trans rights and gender critical feminism, because to even attempt that discussion at the moment will have such grave social consequences, and certainly in terms of career prospects, major consequences, people will not have that discussion. I have people I know in politics, in the media, and they say to me quite honestly, I will not talk about this. I have concerns, I have qualms, I want answers to questions, but I absolutely will not open my mouth about this. And if you don't do that, this is why no one understands the issue. This is why no one has reached any kind of consensus on this issue. All we have is a sense in which to have the quote-unquote wrong opinion makes you a pariah, and therefore I better not have that opinion. Well, then that's not a sincerely held conviction.
If the definition of wrong is continually transforming and in an unpredictable manner, then it's best just to sidestep the issue entirely. And then that leaves it murky and ill-defined, and assuming that you believe that thought has any utility. And so
that's why I say end all this transgender nonsense, right? Because there is other terminology we could be using to describe it and talk about it. And if you go and look at the true creator system and you look at the true creator's work, you're going to see it's feline, canine, rodent, ape, human, and beast. Faces only. I'm showing it to you in the camera now every day. Image within image within image, from the veil to the ground. Get to know the triangular builders, the true creator's work, and what this really is about. It's not about any of these things that the human concept tells us that it is. They give us these little bits and pieces of truth, because then anybody who's transgender is as little of a deal as it already was, because it's 0.1% of the population. Even if we bring it to 0.3% of the population, we're talking about the Earth's population the Earth over, right? So we can look for all kinds of reasonings behind it, but all of it goes away, all hang-ups about it, stereotypes about it, and that goes for race, femininity, because for the fact that the true creator sees us all as one. So therefore we can, once you see that and you know it for yourself, and it's not just some idiot on YouTube telling it to you, and you go look at the system and you'll start to see it and understand, and you'll say, okay, I see what the hell this idiot was saying. So we're all one because the true creator, there's no break. There's no break anywhere. All these images that I'm showing you in the sky run right into this tree, run right into the ground, run right into me, run right into that stone over there. So if you take the biospecies and you take the carbon species and you separate them, which is easy enough to do. In other words, think about it. Think outside the box a little bit, and you think about it. You say, okay, well that there's nothing bio about that stone over there, but yet I'm pulling the same feline, canine, rodent, ape, human, and beast faces only out of that stone as I am out of the and I stay away from things that are human influence, like pavement, right? I'm not going to use the pavement, even though I can do the same thing. Why? Because the pavement is in the system. It's the true creator system. The true creator will build according to whatever, I should say, the true creator's energies will build according to whatever heavy metals and minerals you want to feed it. So the human race denies that that's the way it works, and we say it's all about Trump and it's all about Biden and it's all about these man-made freedoms. Nah, we were closer with the God-given freedoms than we are with this. We all know that what we did was we went from turning God into politics, right? Religions were going to be pushed out, and we were going to bring in nationalism. All countries do this, all over this earth. They all do it, and we're just doing the same fucking thing they were all doing. So now, when you want to end God, they're gonna try to pull us more into nationalism, and so that the nationalists will argue with the left will argue with the right, and all the religions will be torn apart, and everybody will be divided. Transgenders get us arguing with people who are gay, and no conversation about how the gay population has increased. They're just happy that it's increased, and they don't want to, the gay population that is, and they don't want to discuss why that was, because they don't want to look at it as it's a bad thing, and they shouldn't. But to tell you what, as a thing, just being a thing, whether it's good or bad, should be discussed and how it happened. Okay, how did if they want to change it around, then how did so many people get so straight? Let's do it that way. Over the thousands of years, how did, we all started off as, what is the word, eunuchs? If we all started off as eunuchs, I think it's called, with no gender, and let's go from there then, if that'll make everybody who's gay feel better. How did we get to this man and woman sex thing? I'll tell you what, if you look, the penises fit the vaginas, if you go by the colors and by the races and the nationalities. In other words, what energy, where you were, when your carbons were born, and the energies began building you, where your carbons were you. So in my case, I have Polish descent, but so in other words, Polish genes, and here I was born in the United States on the other side of the earth, right? Yeah, pretty much. So therefore, we should be looking for answers to those kinds of things, rather than shrugging them all off and hiding under, just hiding behind it, kind of like ignoring reality, on all sides, it seems to me. Because I'm listening to you guys talk right now, Jordan. Oh, there's my time, right? Yeah, I think my time's up. Um, I'm listening to you talk every day now, and all your lectures and meetings stuff. And believe me, I really like a lot what you got to say. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing a series to you. If I didn't like you, I wouldn't do a series to you. Keep that in mind as I'm ranking you out all the time, because I have no choice. I mean, I'm listening to this shit and I'm like, all right, these guys are brilliant people, man. How could they not have seen this coming? How could they be acting like they don't know what it's all about and that they're looking for answers? It was all told to us. And if in one breath you tell us that in the books you read, different writers were all telling us this stuff was going to be coming, and it was all going to happen. Even in our founding fathers' work, right? Even in our own Constitution, it's written in there that our governments will try to go totalitarian, and all the population, the couple, excuse me, the couple 100 million, at least, all saying to themselves, no, that's weird. I don't know why the founding fathers put that in the paperwork, because I mean, come on, man. Governments love us. They're our politicians. We send them to office. They were our neighbors until we sent them to Washington for us. And the ones that are still here with us, they're working with us. They're not against us. How could they be saying this stuff, you know? And they won't look at the evidence that it's happening. And even when it is happening, they won't consider it. They'll still say, no. You know? Which is kind of what you guys are doing. Just doing it in a, I don't know why, how this could be. I don't know.
From a biological perspective. So imagine a creature that's incapable of thought has to act something out, a representation of the world or an intent. It has to be embodied. And then if that fails, well, it fails in action. And so the consequence of that might be death. It might be very severe. Whereas once you can think, you can represent the world abstractly, you can divorce the abstraction from the world, and then you can produce avatars of yourself, sometimes in image, like in dreams, let's say, or in literature and fiction and movies and so on, produce avatars of ourselves that are fictional, and then run them as simulations in the abstract world and observe the consequences. And we do that in our stories. We do that when we dream. We do that when we imagine in images and depict a dramatic scenario playing itself out. But then we also do that in words, because we encode those images. It's one more level of abstraction. We encode those images into words, and those words become partial dramatic avatars, and then the words can battle with one another. So thought seems to work, let's say verbal thought. You ask yourself a question, you receive an answer in some mysterious manner. There's an internal revelation of sorts. That's